and I will put it full screen now. And good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. Nice to be here. I used to work in GRC myself for some years ago, and but in a different country. So anyway, I will kind of zoom in on to food security crisis, food crisis management a little bit more than or deeper than in the previous session. And I'm very happy to see that Professor Boyne is following me, so I do not have to deal with this transnational crisis management so much, but I will focus on, let's say, on national level in my presentation. I think I was probably invited to do this presentation because of my book, which you can see there. The crisis management cycle is kind of a textbook, basic textbook. But then a couple of years later, I used the same framework to discuss Arctic food crisis management, and I will use that as the basis of my presentation here. So this is a typical crisis management cycle, of course, and everyone knows it. It can be sliced in different ways. I have those phases. One should say that if crisis is more or less like a limited time, even if it would be a creeping crisis or long burning crisis, so it has a certain time. So crisis management doesn't have any time limits. It's always there, and it should always be there. Otherwise, we couldn't manage the crisis when it happens. One should also not take these phases in the face value in such a way that the sequence is exactly sequential, but they typically take place rather much overlapping. But there is a certain before the crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis logic here. In that article which I mentioned, I applied this crisis management cycle thing as a kind of a analytical framework to check the situation when it comes to 3 different kind of possible potential crises. One would be radiological fallout and contamination to the Northern Europe, and another would be oil spills and fishery collapse due to that oil spills and in the Arctic waters, and then animal disease epidemics, which I focus on today to get a little bit more touch on picture about this issue. I even focus a little bit more on one country because it makes it easier to understand, and because Professor Boyne is dealing with transboundary crisis, even if the national crisis also have always a transboundary element. So the point is that I would like to check, I wanted to check that whether there is kind of a effective crisis management system to handle this kind of risk or potential crisis like animal disease epidemics, and then by doing so to identify the bottlenecks and shortcomings in order to enhance the existing crisis management system. And if we start with this risk assessment, which was their kind of a starting point here, so we have to start with very basic issue that whether there is a well-planned and functioning risk assessment system, and believe it or not, that is not always the case. In this case there is, but I will come to the limitations of that later. So it starts from what is the legislation, who are the actors, what is the competent authority, and so on, and whether there is some kind of systematic use of some guidelines or standard like ISO 31000, which is about risk management. also important issue in this context is that whether these animal diseases are, or food security crisis in general, whether they are taken into account in national risk assessments, which all European countries do every third year and report to the Commission. You see the decision there, and believe it or not, but that's not the case always. It wasn't the case in the Finnish national risk assessment. It was missing from there because they thought that it is in some regional risk assessments, and that is enough. And we could discuss about whether it would be needed. But also interesting to notice that pandemics was missing in some of national risk assessments of the European Union countries, including Italy. But there are regional and local risk assessments as well. But then we come to more detailed issues of what animal disease risks are duly assessed and how often. And this leads to also to the issue that what kind of techniques one used to manage this first part, identification of the risks that should be assessed. Here you see a list of some typical animal diseases. They are so-called A-class diseases. When I wrote this article, so this was still kind of a national system. As far as I understand, it should become harmonized into a European Union system, these classes, this year or a little bit later. You see that there are many diseases which many of you probably know. They are not equally relevant to each country. Becomes a little bit more complicated when you think that some of those may be transmitted to humans, and then we know from the current COVID-19 that it probably has some animal origins. So that is animal to human transmitted diseases. It complicates the situation quite a lot, as you understand. Climate change is interesting here. I just mentioned the permafrost melting. So in Russia, especially in the Arctic Russia, so there has been for 100 to 200 years ago, for example, anthrax diseases in cattle, and then they have been buried into the soil and being there safe, and now they are coming up. There is that kind of issues coming up that we perhaps wouldn't very easily imagine. Also, when we speak about Arctic, so the Arctic climate has prevented some insects, for example, to coming to that area and transmitting diseases. How to do that, and which disease risks are duly assessed? So that is not an easy issue because it takes a lot of resources and knowledge. It is not enough to make a scenario and then kind of a likelihood plus salience evaluation kind of. I would say that this is one of the best. You see there, this is one of the best food security risk assessment I have seen, of risk analysis about foot and mouth disease risk. Those who know about risk assessments, they know multicolor simulation, and GRC definitely has a lot of people who know this, and that is quite interesting how good information you can get with that. The point is that you have to have a lot of data about where the farm is, what is the closest farm to that, and how many farms you have, what kind of animals you have, how they are transported, what what are the preparedness levels and so on, and early warning systems and so on. And if you have all that information, so then you can come up to the, you run the simulations as many times as they end, perhaps 1 million times, all the different alternatives, and then you will find this kind of information, which I have written here, that even in the worst case scenario, the outbreak would last only 10 weeks and would affect 29 farms only, and anything would be spiral out of control. But then the issue becomes much more difficult if you do not have this data, if that is about a new kind of risk. The last part of after risk identification and analysis, so is risk evaluation in risk assessment, and that is a tricky thing, because you have to decide that with which risks you go further to what is called in this particular standard to treat them, to do something about them, and that is about a cost-benefit issue and money issue in many ways, and where to put your resources. Do you accept the risk as it is, or do you do something about it? There are certain high risks which you have to do something, but then there is quite a big area usually where you have to do further analysis, and that is often missing in any kind of risk assessments. There are methods to do that, techniques. We go to prevention. So let's take one example, which is vaccination would be a good prevention. Obviously, one could think, but here, for example, the more careful studies show that it would cause more harm than benefit, at least for the farms. Basically, prevention includes this kind of opportunities, as you see there, 7 different kind of opportunities or strategies, and you usually use some kind of a combination of those. Again, here, it is not a one-day brainstorming issue, because a lot of financial and other matters are involved in this kind of decisions, that where to put your resources, what kind of barriers you should build at where. Preparedness was discussed here already. These are a short list of all kind of issues that are related to animal disease type of crisis. They are basically only applications of the general preparedness guidelines that we all know more or less. But someone has to do this. I mean, training exercises, they have to be implemented regularly and so on. So again, it is not a very simple issue to do. We go to response, and that is kind of when we already have the crisis. One could say that these 3 issues should be there always, or they are always there in one way or another. What is often called sense making means that you have to somehow understand that what kind of crisis it is and to whom. For example, if it would come to pandemics, so is it in the early phases it was a health crisis, then it became a social and economic crisis, and I don't even know what it is now. So making a sense of what kind of crisis we are talking about, to whom it is a crisis, and so on. Decision making is a very complicated issue in any crisis. There are different systems, hierarchical, network decision making, and so on, and especially how to coordinate when it is a little bit more complex crisis. Again, not an easy issue to. It's not a seminar issue. There has to be many clever people to figure it out. This communication is kind of interesting, because you may have noticed in your own countries that, for example, in the current pandemic, so perhaps there was a crisis within a crisis created by bad communication and so on. The same goes also with animal disease crisis. Response means decisions, hard decisions, slaughtering and destroying animals, and clearly and cleaning and whatever. One has to be ready for that. One has to have good preparedness in order to do that, but then make a decision whether one would slaughter hundreds or thousands of animals. So it's again a little bit difficult issue. It's not decided by the farmer, but perhaps by the government or veterinarian. Recovery comes then before we end. After that becomes post-crisis learning. So recovery is not only happening when after the crisis, but it's kind of a combination of planned and prepared. It's kind of a preparedness, a proactive phase, and then reactive improvisation measures. And this resilience triangle is quite good in showing that it is not self-evident at all, actually. Performance triangle or resilience triangle, you see those different S1, S2, and so on. So they could be strategies. So if you see that, that S5, for example, so it was very good strategy. It had put all the efforts to protection, but when it was failing, so then it never came back. This might be any kind of system, country or sector or company or farm. And the point here is that you see this triangle there. So the point is to make this triangle as small as possible. And then, as was already mentioned, so sometimes it is possible to build it back better. As you see, there is one strategy which goes upper than it was before, adding something to the previous system. And then in reality, we see many cases where after a crisis, the performance never comes back to the level it used to be. It's partially it is about conscious choice between those strategies, where to put your efforts and money. When it comes to animal issues, so there are many issues that should be animal disease issues. There are many issues that should be taken into consideration. But one is this compensating to farmers. If there is not that kind of system, so then those farms go down. So there are some systems in some countries covering up to 75% of losses, like here in the case of this particular country. But in some countries they are not, and sometimes they are ad hoc issues. Reputation loss is much more difficult to recover from. I leave it you to think. And the last thing here is post-crisis learning. There happens learning all the time during the crisis and before the crisis, and when you have preparedness and training and so on. But if we think in terms of post-crisis learning, so we should try to make it better next time if some kind of similar type of crisis hits, and that is not very simple issue either, because if we think that learning ultimately takes place in a human brain, so how does it become an organizational or even more like country level learning process or EU level learning process? There are many bottlenecks there before even good learning experiences change to organizational policies. And it's also about the degrees of change. Usually the so-called single loop learning is easy. It's more like reacting feedback reactions, doing the same but better. But then it becomes much more complicated when you have to rethink about your goals and perhaps even values. What is important? What is more important, health or economic, for example? It becomes altogether these together, so it becomes quite a difficult thing. Then some conclusions. In this particular case, I noticed that the sector is very well organized, and there is a competent authority, and they know everything about these diseases. But they didn't know much about what would happen in other sectors at the same time, who also would suffer or be involved in this crisis. And it becomes even more problematic if we think this in terms of local, national, regional, and sometimes transnational crisis. So one has to somehow create the multi-level governance approach here, but these two last ones seem to be somehow not missing completely, but they are not developed, and it's difficult to find anyone who masters this whole picture. And especially if you work within one sector, so you typically do not know the other sectors or other levels. So that's my short presentation. I hope it was some kind of food for your thoughts. Thank you.